reason it's not recording. Okay. For some reason they started receiving emails from China, and that's probably due to the news stories on the church. So the news stories on the church cause people to visit our website. Visit our website, they download information, it catches their interest, etc. I think I've mentioned they've had a record response on the website in the past month or so. It literally crashed our server. We had so many people visiting. So how many there would have been if things hadn't crashed. They've moved it to a larger server in the meantime, but they had, well, let me see. Oh yeah, they had something like 16,000 copies of our Statement of Beliefs downloaded. And as a result, in part of this, and actually this did not directly come from the Milwaukee tragedy, but it's interesting. First of all, we have the China emails, which have come from the Milwaukee tragedy. But we received an interesting letter, Mr. Tyler says, from Nepal this week. Now, you know where Nepal is. Everybody know where Nepal is? It's on the northeastern border of China. Of India. So it's actually one of the more backward countries in the world. It's what is the traditional religion in that area? Buddhism. Primarily Buddhism. Although there is some Hindu as well, because just by virtue of being on the border of India. So the letter is from Nepal. It's dated March 17th, 2005. First of all, let me introduce myself to you. I am a pastor of a local church here in Nepal, and my name is Pastor Deepak Shah. I live with my wife and one son and 4 orphan children. I come from an Orthodox Hindu background. My own people are idol worshippers. After my hard work and earnest prayer in the Lord blessed me with 13 more churches in Assam, India, which is a state right next to Nepal, who were once under the bondage of cultism, and through my constant prayer and evangelism these churches are free from the cult religion and now follow the Bible truths. Today we remain an independent church and did not want to be affiliated with any other church due to the doctrines of false teachings that we're afraid that we would be exposed to. Recently the church leaders have discussed about not continuing as an independent church, but to be affiliated with a firm biblical-based church with whom we could learn and teach our people the true doctrine of the Bible. Hence, after going through the directories of different denominations, we found your beliefs and doctrinal statements to be sound and biblical. Hence, we, the church, would like to learn more about biblical truths and become a part of your church as a member. We would like to remain in the truth of your teaching and teach others the same till our Lord Jesus' second coming. Please come and teach us more about the biblical truths of the Bible and help us to expand His kingdom in this Hindu nation. We need your prayer and your help so we can stand strong as brethren in Christ Jesus and carry on the gospel to others who seek after the truth. So again, brethren, we get these from time to time, and not always are they authentic or sincere, but this has a ring of truth to it that even Mr. Tyler noted. And remember what Christ said about lift up your eyes, for the fields are white with harvest? Because they truly are. And one of the reasons God has not tried to call as many people in the Gentile world is because they would respond. Unlike Israelites, with all of our stiff-necked resistance, a lot of these people would respond, and it's not God's purpose to call a large church now. So, however, it goes to show that there are people He's continuing to call because the Living Church of God believes in doing a work. And because our name is out there, we attract these people who now can check us out on the internet before they ever contact us directly. So, Mr. Tyler continues, I had a call this week from a man who was depressed and thinking of suicide. Mr. Tanner and I visited him, and maybe we were able to help. His difficulties were insignificant when compared to what King David and the Apostle Paul had to endure, yet they remained positive. Their eyes were focused on their calling and an incredible future. While we think about the people in China and Nepal and constantly pray for the gospel to be preached to the entire world, we can also have the same positive outlook on life that Paul and David had. We don't know if any of these people will be truly converted in this age, but God has given us a job to do, and while we put our hearts into our prayers and in doing the work, we have the confidence to say, like Paul, I can do and endure all things through Christ who strengthens me, Philippians 4:13. So I just thought it was kind of an interesting thing to realize. In many ways, those in some of these foreign works will occasionally come across some of these people in Africa and Asia particularly, that it's a case of we don't have the resources to even go and deal with these people. So brethren, these are things you can pray about more laborers for the harvest, and not the least of which is more ministers. We've lost through death and other things like people leaving the church, we've lost 7 or 8 pastors over the past year. We've hired 4. That's not a good proportion. So we need to pray very diligently that God would call more laborers for the harvest, which includes folks like you who, with your prayers and your tithes, support the work, but also includes ministers who, the strange thing is, you can't manufacture a minister overnight. If they learn the right way of doing it, maybe because that's the way, you know how egocentric we all are as humans. I was a deacon for 13 years before I became an elder, and naturally I think the best way to be trained to be an elder is to be a deacon for about 13 years. Nonetheless, the principle is that you should, an elder is best prepared through serving people without an office for a long time. That's how you can prove that the motivation is service, not the office. They mentioned that they're beginning to go onto a television program at 5 a.m. on Sunday morning, but their hope is that the 9 regional stations will also pick up the program and give them effectively nationwide coverage in Australia. So do keep praying about that. Now here's the second part, and this is from the same report that we got the other report on Memphusa from Thailand. But he goes into it in a different direction and more depth here, and I just thought it was really inspiring. This is from Memphusa from Thailand. This week we have gotten a witness of faith from a new member who had been attending Sabbath since last October. A 60-year-old woman who was born and grown up in a Sunday worshiping church, this is translated by Memphusa, so I'm reading it straight, has expressed by a written statement in the Burmese language during the service, and I wanted to quote some of her words which I directly translated. The 60-year-old woman, who was a Buddhist, said, I had been throwing my life away from the truth in the past without having knowledge of what it is that makes a person a true Christian. If I didn't move to this place and attend the Living Church of God congregation, I will be continuously failing to know the truth, and I will be in the grave not knowing anything. I now would like to request the church to recognize me for being membership of the Living Church of God by baptism as my daughters. Now, she's referring to the fact that her 2 daughters are members of the church. She's the mother of our baptized members, Mrs. Het Hatar and Miss Lin Lin. Miss Hatar is one of 3 who were baptized in May 2002 by Mr. Bruce Tyler. Miss Lin Lin is one of 8 who were baptized in November 2003 by Mr. Bruce Tyler, Mr. Rajan Moses, and Mr. Thomas Tyle Ho. The 60-year-old woman, Mrs. Da Hla Kai, has joined our video group in late October 2004. Since then, she's been constantly attending the weekly Sabbath and regular Bible study class together with the brethren. So, brethren, I just think it's exciting to realize if I didn't read these things, you wouldn't know in a lot of cases about these things going on. And in some ways, it's one of the most exciting parts of the work I've always felt, is to work in the international work, because the potential is just enormous. And again, it says a lot about these people that as far as people who lasted through the apostasy at the highest percentage of staying faithful, it was some of the most humble people in the church were the brethren in Burma, who something like 95% of them stayed with the faith. So There's a lot being done there that you and I are day to day not aware of, but we really do need to keep them in our prayers. On the Sabbath of the 26th of March, Mr. Joel Fotu was ordained as the first deacon of the Living Church of God in New Zealand. The ordination was performed by visiting Regional Director Mr. Bruce Tyler, who was assisted by the local elder, Kinnear Penman. Mr. Fotu was born in Tonga and is related to the Tongan royal family. He's lived in New Zealand most of his life. He's married to Emma, and they have 3 children. They included a picture of them. And, this is a monumental step for the New Zealand church because they are so small. I think there's only supposed to be something like 50 or 60 members in all of New Zealand, of whom 30 or 40 attend the Auckland church. So I guess it was an opportunity. I asked Daryl Tanner that if it was possible I could keep getting the Australasian news update, because I think it really expands our horizons to keep in touch with what God is doing in other countries. By the same token, be aware that, for instance, my first reaction, the church in Kenya and Tanzania is a very young church in the faith. So they're very vulnerable to a wolf in their midst. And some things have come out about Mr. Ernest Owino, which would tend to put him in that category, by the way. I'm not going to go into detail on them, but suffice it to say that I was amazed to hear that most of the church in Kenya and Tanzania is staying with living, rather than following after Mr. Owino. And part of that is because of his personal example. So personal example can, you can preach all you want to the people of God, but if your personal example is not consistent with that, they're not going to be led astray by you, and that's heartening to know. Now, I mentioned that in terms of Bible studies, we've got a few Bible studies to go through. I intend to go through a couple of Bible studies that are more what you'd call gross background material on comparative religion. After we complete the church history series, I'm going to do a series on some of the other religions of this world: Buddhism, Islam, possibly Judaism, to try to give you just a little bit of context so that when those issues are raised from any of those different directions, you can understand a little bit about where people are coming from. Because, brethren, in the kingdom of God, we will be dealing with people from all of these different kinds of backgrounds. And sometimes it's helpful to understand what motivates a pagan. Do you know, for instance, that Buddhism had to change when Christianity encountered it? Why? Because the Buddhists sat back and realized they weren't offering very much. Their idea is, you become, the highest thing is to become joined with the cosmic intelligence or whatever, nirvana or whatever. You lose yourself into this cosmic intelligence. You have no individual existence beyond that. Well, Christianity came along and they had something better to offer, and Buddhism had to change because they didn't offer very much. Why change my life according to the instruction of Buddha? There didn't seem to be much reward for it. This is somewhat analogous to what Paul said when he said, if we in this life only have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. If there isn't an afterlife, if there isn't a reward, if there isn't something to continue, then what's the point? So, and particularly, we're going into a little bit more depth on the Catholicism so that we can understand the system that is going to be the prime persecutor of the Church of God in coming years. In many ways, when you study the history of the Catholic Church, it's very difficult to understand why anybody could be a good, sincere Catholic. I'm not serious. I'm going to take you through some things today that just are the scratching of the tip of the iceberg, but are close enough to the pedophile crisis, homosexual and pedophile crisis the Catholic Church now has going, to say that crisis is not that uncommon a scandal for the Catholic Church. And so it's amazing to me anybody could still be a sincere Catholic in many ways. Okay, we covered some of the doctrines more last time. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about somewhat about the doctrines, but mostly about the historical progression of the Catholic Church. We'll be reading from various reference books, but and I'll try and cite them as much as possible, from a book called The Popes and Their Church by Joseph McCabe. Of all the fictions which still shelter from the storm of modern criticism under the leaky umbrella of Catholic truth, the legend of the divine foundation of the papacy and the papal system is quite the boldest and most romantic. No divine force, but a pitifully human series of forgeries and coercions, of pious frauds and truculent ambitions perpetrated in an age of deep ignorance, built up papal power, hierarchy, and creed. Now, I'm not doing this to put the Catholic Church down, but to show you that that which has persecuted the Church of God has been primarily the Catholic Church over the years, though not exclusively. They surround themselves, and it's a church that Satan built for his purposes. And they surround themselves with a shield of piety, but you don't have to scratch much under that surface to find corruption. And one would think that would tell you something, because you don't have to be in the church to scratch beneath that surface. Yes, there's a lot of rabid Catholic haters out there, and I'm not talking about them, but all you have to do is look at the facts. Now, for instance, one of the things that has actually been a late development, as I understand it, the papal infallibility was not enthroned as an absolute doctrine until 1870. Now, I thought it went back a lot further than that, but that's what we're told in this one book, The Spirit of Catholicism, by Carl Adams. The Catholic sorrowfully recognizes that even the holders of the highest and most exalted office on earth can be children of their age and slaves of its conceptions, and that the Holy Spirit in governing the Church does not guard every act of the Pope, but is infallibly operative only when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which means when basing himself on the sources of the faith and in the fullness of his power as head of the Church and successor of St. Peter, he pronounces a decision in faith or morals which embraces or binds the whole Church. In other words, when he speaks from the throne of St. Peter in an official capacity, he is accorded infallibility. Now, oddly enough, there have been many decisions from that throne that have contradicted one another. Somehow that's still infallible. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you go back into the Middle Ages, there's a reason they were called the Dark Ages. They were dark. So the culture and the society was dark. The worst of the Dark Ages ran between about 800 and about 11 or 1200 A.D. In fact, around 900 to 1000 A.D. was called the midnight of the Dark Ages. Incredible corruption existed within the Catholic Church. The 900 A.D. Was what they call the rule of the harlots. Papacy was very corrupt for a period of about 600 years, and it only varied in the depth of its corruption. From about 900 to about 1500 A.D., when the Reformation forced them to address issues that they didn't have to address before. So much power was concentrated in the ecclesiastical realm, so much wealth, that the corruption they could sweep under the carpet, or they didn't even care to sweep it under the carpet because the people had no power to resist them. It was a time that it would be very difficult to be in society and follow the ways of God at all. From the popes and their church, we read, this is talking about Pope John the 12th, one of the worst popes of all time, guilty of almost any crime you could imagine. Lutprand tells us how John, pressed by a rival, appealed to the Emperor Otto, and when Otto came to Rome, the Romans brought up against their spiritual father, the Pope, Pope John the 12th, a list of crimes which would, they said, make a comedian blush for shame. And a comedian was considered the lowest things that they knew. The Romans were lenient, but they could not tolerate a pope who committed, and this is what they accused John the 12th of committing, and it's pretty much been verified by history: murder, perjury, adultery, incest with his two sisters, rape, and sacrilege. Before the synod convoked by Otto, the emperor, it was proved that John had turned the Lateran Palace, that's the papal palace, into a brothel, cut out the eyes or castrated those who criticized him, raped girls and women who came to pray at St. Peter's, gambled, cursed, and drunk to the devil. There was, in brief, nothing that he had not done. And this is at the very... You think we've had problems in the Church of God. Nothing like this. And really we could go on for hours on this. I'm just going to hit a couple of high points. Boniface VII murdered Pope John XIV to gain the throne of the Pope. Oftentimes in this period, the papal offices were bought and sold. The Medici family from Venice came and were popes, and they couldn't care less about religion. It was a power struggle. The papacy was the prime place that you could go to concentrate power. That's the reason they went after it. And many of the offices of priests and bishops and cardinals and everything else were bought and sold. This happened, by the way, to the priesthood at times in Israel as well, interestingly enough. Pope John XIV went through the ranks of the priesthood in one day to become pope. So he had to be a priest, he had to be a cardinal, he had to be a bishop of cardinal. So in one day he went through all of those. Competing with, John XII for the title of the worst pope would be Pope Benedict IX, 1033 to 1039. He bought the office at 12 years of age and committed tremendous sins to compete with John XII. So during the worst part of the Dark Ages, here we're talking about 900 to 1000, they were pretty much unchallenged in their power. The only time they'd ever turn to secular rulers is if they were under pressure and they needed help. So then they'd offer various and sundry things. And we're going to hear a little bit later about some of the things they offered throughout the Crusades. It's the type of thing that makes a mockery of the truth of the Bible. It really does. And that's what tells you, of course, who's behind it. So in the late 1100s, some power started to be concentrated in the German emperors of what was called the Holy Roman Empire at that time. Pope Gregory VII was the first to begin discouraging the reading of the Bible. Now, why would he do that? There was pressures that began in about that period. Now, again, printing wasn't invented until, 1540 or something? When they had the first printing press. But copies of the Bible began to be more frequently circulated in the first 500 years after 1000 A.D. And so he had to begin to discourage the reading of the Bible. Why would he do that?
Probably friendly his position.
Okay, well, we've talked about this before. If you read the Bible and you compare it to the Catholic Church, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that there's no connection between the two. That's why he didn't want them reading it. They claimed biblical authority, but they didn't want people seeing that they weren't doing what the Bible said. The entire system that was the clergy was run as a giant racket. They became the wealthiest people in Europe. More wealth was concentrated. If you strove to become a priest, not because you wanted to serve people, but because that's a way to become filthy rich. Priests commonly kept mistresses. They would have whole family. There was one pope who had a whole family of 12 kids illegitimately, lived with him in the Lateran Palace. They were open about it. Now, one of the things that began happening, hopefully if we get time we'll get to this a little bit more, in about 1100, Urban II began the first of the Crusades. Now, officially, the main motive for the Crusades was to free the Holy Land, but the second purpose, and the idea was you raise up this army of undisciplined rabble, basically, and the idea is you craft it in this lofty thing. We're going to go free the Holy Land from the infidels, the Muslims, but once you get this group together, they're almost impossible to control, number one. And the only thing I was reading about the way the Sudanese are using their jana weed to kill so many people in the region of Darfur in Sudan today is that some of them are regular army that they pay, but most of them are people who you're paid with the plunder you're able to get. And so the idea is you go and you kill everybody, you can take away everything they own. And you don't own anything, so therefore anything they own is a net gain. And that's all you have to offer to humanity oftentimes to get them to do atrocious things. Exactly the same thing happened with the Crusades. Oftentimes they would ravage whole regions of the Roman Empire on their way to the Holy Land. Kill, rape, murder, everything, and loot all their way along, heading down to the Holy Land. They even caused, at one time in the Crusades, the fall of the Eastern Emperor, because they destroyed Constantinople. And oftentimes they were exhausted by the time they got to the Holy Land. They couldn't fight the Muslims then. It was a ridiculous, contradictory institution, the Crusades. Later on in the Crusades, they began to be used against heretics. So who are some of the people that suffered savagely at the hands of the Crusaders? The Church of God. The Church of God. They were used against anybody who disagreed or threatened the power base of the Catholic Church. The peak of papal power was in... Say that 10 times fast. The peak of papal power was in 1198 through about 1216, beginning with Innocent III, who wasn't. He was called the most powerful pope, called himself the Vicar of God, the Vicar of Christ, and the supreme power of the world. He was a very humble man. He claimed the right to depose any king and priest. All things on earth were subject to the Vicar of Christ, and basically said that everybody owed him allegiance. He was a megalomaniac, in other words. And, again, those that are behind him, Satan the devil, certainly sees himself as the king of the whole earth, so it's not too surprising. This is when penance indulgences come into play, where you could get out of penance by paying for it and things like that. Indulgences, special services, being granted things instead of having to do penance in exchange for political gifts or trades or whatever. It was the most cynical way possible to run a church, is what happened. Now, humankind cannot do something like this if you've got opposing force. Why were they able to do this? They didn't care if the people saw that they were corrupt, because there was no opposing force. They really were the center of political, military, and economic power at that time. Okay, from Developments of Roman Catholicism, we read, one of the most disastrous developments of Romanism, and one that brought more shame and misery into its history than perhaps any other, is its doctrine of indulgences. That doctrine is that the Church has the power to grant the penitent due to them, that doesn't make any sense. Anyway, to grant people release from temporal punishment, or punishment that is endured in purgatory, or that will be endured even, not from hell. I don't think that they could get released from purgatory. But the idea is, the ground that they used, and it's amazing that they even bothered to try to justify this, but they said the merit and the mercy of Christ was so great that He has so much extra mercy that the church has the right to dole that mercy out as it sees fit for its benefit. And therefore, if you knew your Aunt Martha was frying in purgatory, because purgatory is like hell, almost as bad, and you could get her out by doing favors for a priest, if you were a woman, or by paying money to the church, or by granting your lands to the church, they would write you a little piece of paper that says, okay, in fact there was a ditty about it. You remember when the coins in the box clink, the soul from purgatory springs, or something like that. Now, think about the logic of that. The humankind in a corrupt manner, and God would operate according to that. He'd release somebody from purgatory. Where's the fairness of the God they're worshiping? If the person deserves to be in purgatory according to their screwed up system, then, somebody paying money is not going to teach that person whatever lessons they're supposed to learn by suffering in purgatory. I mean, the whole thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? But this is the system that ruled most of the world for many, many years. Now, for instance, you could get credit. It's like extra credit in school, only this is extra credit against purgatory, by killing a heretic. So what does that do? That gives every person out there, this is a little community in the French Alps. This is the church member who's keeping the Sabbath and everything else, and your motivation is you kill him and you can get out of purgatory free. You get a little card that says, I get out of jail free. And people believe this with their whole heart. Again, you don't have to give humankind very much justification to say it's okay to loot and kill him, and God will give you special favor if you do. Therefore, the Catholic Church doesn't have to send a priest to go after this guy. He'll be taken care of. It's a system like the communist system where people could turn their neighbors in, and it creates an atmosphere of fear. This is about the time that the Bible actually came to be forbidden to read in the vernacular, meaning in the local language. If it was to be read at all, which the common person didn't have access to, it was to be read in Latin only. From the Popes and Their Church by Joseph Macabre, we read, "You rub your eyes or your ears and you inquire further and you discover the most ingenious system that was ever devised for keeping educated people uneducated. This is the system of Catholic truth. The Catholic is required, under penalty of eternal damnation, to read his own literature only that has been duly authorized by the bishop, whose stamp is stamped on the front page to say this is approved reading material, and must not read any that differs from it. Catholics are kept safe within the compound of Catholic truth, and it is understood that quaint doctrines may be imposed under such circumstances." By this system, and it was so all-encompassing, brethren, that it got to the point there was one emperor that displeased the Pope in what he did. He was required to come, bow on his knees, crawling on his knees to this Pope, and beg for absolution, because he was bought into the system. He knew that he was under threat of excommunication. He would fry in hell. He would humiliate himself to be able to get the absolution from the Pope. This man had the power of eternity, eternal damnation in his hands. So this guy just absolutely, to read the account, it's a little difficult to read. He just absolutely humiliated himself, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, to obtain the Pope's forgiveness. So by this system, you bring the entirety of the culture of a society under control of a group of people, an oligarchy in effect. That's what they were trying. This is what the beast and the false prophet are going to be trying. Well, actually, false prophet more. Beast has his own motivations. False prophet is going to be trying to reconstruct. This is their ideal, where they have total control. All of the monarchs of Europe obeyed the will of the Pope in this period. Now, it began to unravel, as human power structures will. But this is where the crusade system got started, and there were 7 or 8 crusades, depending on who's counting. This is where the doctrines of transubstantiation came during this period. That, again, what is transubstantiation?
The actual wine turns into blood.
The actual wine that the priest is the only one that drinks, right, in the Catholic Church, and the bread becomes actually the flesh of Jesus Christ. Now, if you really believed that, how many of us would be able to get that down? They accuse the Church of God of and the Jews of using the blood of babies at Passover. Well, theirs is the doctrine that said that every true Christian had to be a cannibal, in effect. This is when they began. Okay, that's what I thought. This is when they began the doctrine of papal infallibility, and popes claimed it, but for some reason it wasn't codified until 1870, which I mentioned earlier. And I always wondered about that. Interestingly enough, what do you think the view of the Pope was on the Magna Carta? Now, most of us have had lousy historical education, but the Magna Carta was a document in 14th century or 15th century England that recognized the rights of the individual as opposed to the ruling power. The Pope was totally against it. He condemned it. Because under the papal system, you have no rights. The only one who has rights are the Pope and the structure he sets up. So they utterly condemned the idea that the common man had any rights at all. Now, once they started the Inquisition, which started in the 1200 AD region, do you know that the inquisitors never performed the torture or the death? Well, the torture they did, but they didn't kill. What would they always do? If those of you read it, they would turn the person, heretic, over, if you didn't recant, to the civil authorities, and the civil authorities were the ones that killed, and that way they kept their hands clean in their view. The system was that basically there were 3 inquisitors for every trial. There were 3 basic tortures. The worst torture was by fire. They used the Bible for justification, and you were not allowed to present a defense. Great system, wasn't it? You had somebody who envied your property and wanted to loot it or split it with the church. He would bring an accusation against you, and the burden of proof was on you. Imagine the system of fear and paranoia would be created by this. Killing became indiscriminate before the popes even realized themselves they'd gone too far. They had to restrain it. They became incredibly ingenious when it came to matters of torture, which boggles the mind that humans can do this to one another, but they're doing it in North Korea now as we speak. So humanity is fully capable of doing this. And humanity's inventiveness when it comes to inflicting pain upon another human being boggles the mind. Much of the motivation for accusation and inquisitor trials and so forth was money or power. The interesting thing is no pope has ever apologized for the excesses of the papacy in the Middle Ages, and no pope has apologized for the Inquisition until John Paul II, who mentioned it while he was in Spain about 10 years ago. Prior to that, no pope ever apologized because they felt like they don't have to apologize for anything. What they've done, infallibility, it may have been corruption, it may have been terrible, but it was God that did it, and they have nothing to apologize for. Even though it's funny that Dante's Inferno, what was it called, the Divine Comedy, was written as a parody. It was not intended to be a serious representation of heaven and hell, and yet it has become inculcated into Catholic teaching as what heaven and hell are like, even though he wrote it in part to mock the Catholic Church. Dante called the Catholic Church a sewer of corruption. So it's weird that his very book, The Divine Comedy, became the foundation of much of Catholic teaching on heaven and hell. Now, the Crusades, as I say, initially started out as a lofty thing that they were going to go free the Holy Land from the Muslims, but they got corrupted real quickly. From the Catholic Encyclopedia Volume 4, we read, "The Crusades were expeditions undertaken in fulfillment of a solemn vow to deliver the holy places from Mohammedan tyranny. The origin of the word may be traced to a cross made of cloth and worn as a badge on the outer garment of those who took part in these enterprises. The meaning of the word crusade has been extended to include all wars undertaken in pursuance of a vow and directed against infidels, whether they be Mohammedans, pagans, heretics, or those under ban of excommunication. After pronouncing a solemn vow, each warrior received a cross from the hand of the Pope or his legates and was therefore considered a soldier of the Church. Crusaders were also granted indulgences and temporal privileges, such as an exemption from civil jurisdiction, inviolability of land, persons or lands, and etc." Now, this got so bad that basically, in effect, if you went on a crusade successfully and didn't desert, you were granted release from purgatory and straight into heaven. Now, we look down on the Muslims who claim that by waging jihad and dying as a martyr of jihad, you can of jihad, that's a doctrine that we have nowadays in the Islamic religion, but they had it then. In effect, it's the same basic concept. And it gives you absolution for some of the most horrible things anybody could ever do. It's okay because you're under a stamp of approval from the religious authority at that time. We're told it's we got to be out of here by 6, so just so we don't have to chase everybody out, I'll go ahead and cover most of the rest of this. I was going to summarize much of this on the Crusades anyway, because it just goes on and on. But there's some really interesting things that come out of it, and one of the Crusades was directly particularly against the Waldensians, which were our Thyatiran ancestors. So we'll cover that next time.